Hello and welcome to the second event in week 2 of the Inspiring Minds Welcome season, Somewhere Over the Rainbow, Gender and Sexuality. Today's event, as you know, is titled Fiction and Film on Steroids. It's great to see some familiar names from other events, including those last week, that was the Matter of Black Lives week, and also some new names joining us. Yesterday, we kicked off this week's events with a really thought-provoking and action-provoking reading group in which we discussed queer of colour feminisms, specifically the work of Sara Ahmed and her Killjoy Manifesto, which offers practical principles for confronting inequalities in institutions and beyond. We talked about being killjoys, pointing out inequalities in the institutions we inhabit, and also the possible joys in killing joy. Tomorrow, we have a screening of an inspiring documentary, A Litany for Survival, The Life and Work of Audre Lorde, followed by an intergenerational, multiracial, cross-disciplinary discussion and poetry readings. And for the discussion, we'll be joined by Dr. Victoria Shawunmi from UCL's Institute of Education, and second-year students, Noella Kalasa from Natural Sciences, who's the co-founder of the UCL Justice Collective, and Deepali Foster, who you've seen elsewhere in the programme, who's a second-year English student working to increase accessibility to the theatre and journalism sectors. On Friday, we have a creative workshop with UCL researchers Lo Marshall and Dr. Ezra Horbury, and we'll be working with writing and photography in that event. All genders are welcome to all events. Turning to today's event on contemporary masculinities, today's roundtable discussion, which I'm really excited about, will be chaired by Dr. Tim Beasley-Murray, Associate Professor of European Thought and Culture, whose vision is behind the Inspiring Minds programme. Over to you, Tim.
Great. Thank you so much, Natasha, for welcoming me, for welcoming us, and for setting this event in the context of the Gender and Sexuality Somewhere Over the Rainbow week that you've so brilliantly put together. We're very excited to welcome those of you who have turned up as attendees to this, and also particularly Dr. Matthew Sperling and Professor Stella Bruzzi, who I will introduce properly to you in a moment. But first of all, a word about how this session fits into this week and maybe the weeks of the season as a whole. As Natasha said, yes, last week we were talking about the matter of Black lives, and we thought about Blackness and its intersection with queerness and so on. And this week we had a discussion yesterday about Sara Ahmed and her Killjoy Manifesto, ideas once again of queerness and how they relate to race. And we're going to talk about Audre Lorde, and we're going to have a workshop on trans creativity and so on. So why then do we have today? Why then do we have this discussion of masculinity, right? Where does that fit in? Well, yes, we're going to have Stella's perhaps theoretical reflections on masculinity as a style, as a cinematic style, but we're also going to have Matthew's novels, which are, let's say, at least on first reading and perhaps on second, pretty unashamedly masculine text, almost priapic in their narrative energy. They're about a celebration of masculinity and its transformative effects and so on. So why are we looking at masculinity, and perhaps even more, perhaps white masculinity? That may be a question we could raise with Matthew. Now, to answer that, I want actually to draw on a passage that Stella writes in her book, looking at masculine cinema, and maybe to suggest that, okay, in a ratio of 1 to 4, we have four events this week, there's certainly an important place for stopping to think about masculinity. So I'm going to read you the passage and just comment on it briefly. And I was going to try and put it in the chat, but I'll do that in a second. So Stella says, masculinity as a concept and style was taken for a long time to be the universal, the known, not the other, which more urgently merited critical scrutiny and definition. Just as whiteness has also done, masculinity, and here she's quoting someone else, secures its dominance by seeming not to be anything in particular. And yet, under scrutiny, it is often revealed as emptiness, absence, denial, or even a kind of death. And then she carries on to quote another critic, Nicola Railing, who identifies her reasons for examining Hollywood films, and she says, popular films are often far more complex than they tend to be given credit for, brackets, rather like straight men, and frequently contain ruptures, gaps, tensions, and incoherencies that indicate collective anxieties and desires, as well as ideological conflict, as so straight men. And Stella concludes, my study takes as its starting point the need to examine what, in inverted commas, everyone knows, namely the most mainstream, omnipresent, and ordinary forms of cinema, and identifies within this apparent universal what can be positively defined as men's cinema, as opposed to what is merely taken for granted. Okay. So I will pop that quotation up in the chat. Oh no, it's not working for me. Never mind, I'll do that later. But I think we want to follow Stella's lead here. I think what we're doing is focusing on masculinity, the thing that everybody seems to know, in fact, straight white masculinity, and seeing it not as the universal, but actually exploring it in order to find within it its emptinesses, its ruptures, its gaps, its tensions, its absences, its denials, and so on. And I think this perhaps is something that, at least for one of these events out of the ones that we're presenting for you in this Gender and Sexuality week, for one of these events, that seems to me a valid task. So just a few comments on how this early evening is going to run. First of all, we're going to talk about Matthew's novel, AstroTurf, which I have here, which is perhaps of the two that he's written so far, these wonderful books, the most strikingly about masculinity. Then we're going to move to Stella. Stella's going to present some of ideas, but we hope that Matthew and Stella will engage and that the conversation will percolate with their interactions. And then we're going to briefly introduce to you this new novel, hot off the press, for which I believe there is a discount. You can go away and buy it, which is Matthew's Viral, which came out, I think, about a month ago. And first of all, a few words about Matthew and Stella, starting with Stella first. So Stella is, of course, as you know, our illustrious Dean, Professor Stella Bruzzi. She's Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities. And she has a long and distinguished career before coming to UCL. She'd been at Warwick, and before that at Royal Holloway and the University of Manchester. And she's published an extraordinary range of writing, of books and articles and so on, within the discipline largely of film and television, although an interesting sideline about fashion, and that's actually her first book, is about clothing and identity in the movies. But as I say, she's written a whole range of texts, really founding an important book about documentary called New Documentary, A Critical Introduction, that has been widely translated. But she's also written about the subject of today. She's written about fatherhood and masculinity in Hollywood, and she wrote an important book in which came out in 2013 that I think she's be drawing on today, Men's Cinema, Masculinity and Mise en Scène in Hollywood. And just recently, actually, despite her very onerous duties as Dean, she's managed to publish a new book, just come out this year, which is on documentary again. Isn't that right, Stella? Yes.
It's kind of documentary and representations of history and fact in other media. Yeah.
Fantastic. So the Professor Stella Bruzzi for you. And then our other participant today is Dr. Matthew Sperling, although likewise from the English department. Matthew has an interesting sort of amphibian nature, and it might be interesting to talk perhaps a little bit later on about the way in which he lives on both in water and on the land. He has a very serious scholarly profile, a book on Geoffrey Hill, Interesting, Geoffrey Hill is always talked about as the most difficult poet, right? Extraordinary, sort of dense and abstruse. And yet he is also, when he's, I don't know which is land and which is water, but when he's in his other element, he's an important creative writer with these novels. And I'd be interested to ask you perhaps later about the relationship between this very difficult poetry that you unpack and, you know, to such success, very well reviewed book on Geoffrey Hill, but perhaps the much more digestible, almost deliberately easy. I know it probably wasn't easy to write, but it's certainly easy to read. We want to turn the pages of these books with extraordinary speed of your fiction writing. But we're here to talk about Matthew really today as a writer of fiction. His novel AstroTurf came out in 2018. It's been described, as in the title of this event, as fiction on steroids, also quite nicely as a brawn cocktail. I thought that was quite good in the review in the Irish Times, but it's a hugely successful book. It was shortlisted for the Wellcome Prize, a lovely prize that the Wellcome Foundation puts for books with a medical theme. And has done very well. Fantastic reviews in New Statesman and elsewhere. And then he, as I say, but we'll talk about this later, followed this up with Viral, which is sort of continuation of AstroTurf that has just come out now. But if I can, Matthew, I'd like to turn to you first, and I'd like to talk about AstroTurf and why we're here, right? AstroTurf is a novel about bodybuilding, it's about internet fraudsters and cons, but perhaps you, in your own words, you could tell us something of the premise of this fantastic novel that you've written and how perhaps it links through to Stella's work on a masculine aesthetic. You know, perhaps you didn't start off wanting to write a book about masculinity, but I wonder if you could tell us about the book and how it fits in to ideas of masculinity and even to ideas of masculine aesthetic.
Yes, thank you, Tim. Well, a lot of things to say about that. As I've said before in interviews, people always ask about masculinity, and it wasn't what I thought I was thinking about when I wrote the book. But it is a book which begins by focusing on the gym and on weightlifting and on physical culture and on the weird subculture of people who take weightlifting so far that they want to use anabolic steroids and get into the sort of bodybuilding scene. And that seemed interesting to me for all sorts of reasons. And so, yes, okay, so it's about a character who kickstarts his own plot in life by using synthetic testosterone. So masculinity, I sort of want to caveat that in a sense that men and women both have testosterone and estrogen in their bodies in different quantities. It varies a lot across the population, and these things are easily changeable. So I sort of feel like the moment at which Ned in my book takes this into his own hands and decides to make this weird intervention into his own life, which will change his body composition, and then he finds that it has all sorts of knock-on effects in his mental and social life, which he may or may not be correct in perceiving, but they're real in the way that he experiences his life. So that's the sort of way I came into it, that through discovering or through thinking about this sort of weirdly interesting and just kind of deeply strange subculture, and this kind of practice, and then thinking about the ways that might relate to the everyday practices of living. And in a way, the topic seemed like a bit of a gift, because actually it is something that the more I looked into it, nobody had really written about before, despite the fact that kind of gym going has become more and more widespread, and that actually, you know, steroid use is fairly widespread as well, but never spoken about really.
I think that's, you know, this subculture you draw with such intimate knowledge and, you know, so vividly for us. But I think this is one really interesting point about the book. The book perhaps seems to be this celebration of testosterone, right, and celebration of this hyper-masculinism that Ned becomes part of. But ultimately, it's synthetic, right? It comes out of a vial, right? And I think that's one of the perhaps ambiguities. Maybe that is the second reading, or at least it's there in the first reading, that it seems less straightforwardly a celebration. If in fact Ned, you know, needs to inject it, it's something he literally buys off the internet, his masculinity.
Yeah, and that's the way I wanted to write it, was to have a very restricted third-person narrative that never strays from what the characters are thinking about themselves and about their own experience, so that the reader then has to make the judgment on at which moments Ned is misunderstanding his own experience and sort of mistaking the way that he appears to other people.
Right. Well, let's talk about the matter of how we judge this. And I think your very detached third-person narrator who doesn't intrude at any point is part of, you know, there's a deliberate detachment, a deliberate coolness, perhaps. You know, I think this is a novel that's about coolness. Perhaps let's give a taste for people who are here of what this novel is about, and give the passage that we were talking about earlier, which really Ned gets pumped up, right? That is perhaps how we could call this chapter.
Yeah. So at the beginning of the book, Ned is a sort of physically average person, and also I sort of wanted him to be kind of deliberately average in all sorts of ways. There's a moment late in the book when he gets a redundancy payment, and if you back calculate from there, you can work out that he's earning the exact median wage for someone living in London at that point. So he's doing okay. You know, he thinks of himself as a loser, but in fact he's living a statistically average life. And then he has this suggestion put to him by a kind of unscrupulous personal trainer that he could optimize himself in all sorts of ways by simply applying these laboratory versions of naturally occurring steroid hormones to his body. And so this passage comes when he's done this, and he's observing how it impacts on his gym going and his weightlifting practice. So when I talk about a cycle here, it means a steroid cycle, which is how steroid users plan their drug regimes. While Ned was on cycle, lifting was euphoric. He was able to push himself as hard when he went to the gym on his own as he did when Darius trained him. He was going to the gym 4 times a week. He would see Darius for a chest and back day, then come in on his own for legs and shoulders, then arms, then another chest and back day, before seeing Darius again for a leg and shoulders day, and so on. Each time he increased the weights he was lifting, and each time he found he could master the new weight, keep good form, and hit his muscles hard. When he did a chest and back workout and was on his last set of incline chest flies, lying on his back on the sloping bench with 24-kilogram dumbbells in each hand, he would take the weight down low so that his arms were fully spread and his elbows were lower than his chest, and would squeeze, bringing it back past the point where it felt like his pectorals were about to shear off from his sternum and his arms were going to rip from his shoulders, then would push through the burn and finish the set before collapsing, totally spent. He felt like his arms, chest and back were somebody else's. When he bench pressed, he felt like there were an invisible pair of hands supporting his elbows and pushing them up. Weights on which he would previously have wobbled and halted mid-lift were weights he could now smash through to the top of a rep, then lower down with strong control to full extension and smash upwards again. He started moaning and grunting as he lifted. Within a month, he could do 20 wide grip pull-ups without a pause. Darius sent Ned a YouTube clip that showed Arnold Schwarzenegger in Pumping Iron talking about the feeling of a pump when he had just finished an exercise and massive levels of blood were rushing into his swollen muscles, so it felt like his skin was going to explode. It's as satisfying to me as coming is, you know, as having sex with a woman and coming, he said. So can you believe how much I am in heaven? I'm getting the feeling of coming in the gym. I'm getting the feeling of coming at home. I'm getting the feeling of coming backstage when I pump up. When I pose out in front of 5,000 people, I get the same feeling. So I am coming day and night. I mean, it's terrific, right? Ned was starting to understand what Schwarzenegger meant. After a workout, Ned would crawl to the locker room and collapse on the bench, feeling loopy, lightheaded, and barely able to move. His body was changing. Within a fortnight, his abdominals were visible, the skin was tight across them, and the ridges of muscle cast shadows across his body in the dim lighting of the basement changing room. His shoulders were getting broader, his lats were thickening, his pectoral muscles were becoming thick and shapely, and now almost disguised the slight depression in the middle of his chest by pulling his ribcage into position. The veins in his forearms looked swollen and vaguely obscene. When he bent his arm, his biceps tensed to a hard, round peak, the skin tight across the muscle. When his arm hung loose at his side, it felt strong and substantial. His body was becoming substantial. He was becoming solid.
Great, thank you, Matthew. That's a fantastic passage. I should have mentioned before, actually, I was going to say something, a little bit of a trigger warning. We are talking about some quite full-on stuff here, and as Freud always used to say in his lectures, we are going to be calling spades spades of different sorts. So I just want you to be aware of that. There's a passage I may or may not quote later on. So this is this transformation, right, that Ned undergoes, that he brings about himself, but one that is artificial, one that is fake. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the sort of the faking it aspect, right? The title AstroTurf, perhaps you could explain for those who are, I certainly had to look it up, but the way in which this is about not necessarily masculinity as it is, whatever that might be, but masculinity as it's performed, whether chemically induced or whether played out online or whatever. To what extent is this actually quite a meta-literary novel, one that points perhaps to things like Patricia Highsmith, that's about performing, pretending, not really the substance behind it?
Yeah, so the title AstroTurf, I'm using in the metaphorical sense that begins in electoral politics and has become a kind of term throughout advertising, which is to do with faking grassroots support. So, you know, when a politician or an organization or a company wants to make it appear that they have a broad base of popular support for the thing they're trying to promote, they'll run an AstroTurf campaign. And this is obviously something that's been accelerated in the online age, where AstroTurfing is that much easier to do. You can create all sorts of bots and, you know, empty avatars to make it look like there's a popular support for whatever you want. So so in the novel, after Ned has made this innovation in his personal life or in his biochemical life of using synthetic testosterone, he then kind of goes back into the online community of people talking about and selling anabolic steroids, and he sets up his own kind of scamming operation where he ends up selling fake versions of these chemicals to people using AstroTurf puppets, so that then he has to, the sort of later part of the book, yeah, I think it does have this metafictional quality, but it's where he sets up all of these fake identities for himself. But I guess I did want readers to think about the analogy between those two halves of the plot, that in a sense the kind of creative freedom he experiences in that enterprise of creating all of these online identities for himself is sort of enabled by what he's done in the earlier part of the book, and the kind of freedom that that using steroids and changing his physiology gave him to be a different version of himself and to sort of surprise himself. That in a sense it then leads to this expanded sense of personal possibilities of kind of pretending to be other people online.
I mean, sorry to interrupt, Matthew. I mean, you say expanded senses of possibilities, but there's another way of looking at this plot, right? Early on, Ned has a conversation with Piotr, someone in his work, and they get drunk in a pub together, and it turns out that Piotr is an inhabitant of the manosphere. He's on 4chan, and he's definitely one of these sort of, you know, alt, new, far right internet activists who's against women's rights. He's taken the blue or the red pill, or whichever one it is, I don't never know. And he basically, Ned says to Piotr, you know, drunk, he says, the problem with my girlfriend is that she's never let me have anal sex with her. Right? And then he goes and he gets pumped up and so on. And then right at the end of the novel, in the penultimate chapter, he meets up with what is by now his ex-girlfriend, and she allows him to have anal intercourse with her. And it's as if the whole purpose of this is some sort of revenge, right? He's this ordinary, you say average, but perhaps a bit of a loser, who through the use of these steroids takes revenge on a society that doesn't accept him, from girlfriends who are posher than him or sexier than him, who don't really value him. Isn't this novel a bit like the sort of fantasy wish fulfillment of, you know, some 4chan person sitting in his, you know, bedsit thinking that, you know, feminism and everything else has conspired against him? Isn't that a worrying reading of this novel?
Well, okay. And I think you've experienced this aspect of the book much more strongly than my other readers have. I guess it goes back. I guess it does hinge on a sort of question about what are you doing when you write satire. And when I wrote this book, my kind of deep instinctive sense was that the serious thing to do would be to write a book which is totally complicit with its own materials, right? If we're talking about toxic masculinity, if we're talking about how pornography has kind of corroded this sense of sexual connection, if we're talking about all of these questions, I wanted to write the book which doesn't stand aside from those things, because I guess it seemed to me that that's a kind of useless gesture. That if what we're saying about white masculinity is true, then of course I didn't want to write the book which sort of says, gosh, look at this terrible stuff over here, thank God I'm not like that, you know, because that seems to me the kind of useless kind of liberal gesture, which often introduces a kind of dishonesty into lots of writing, but also I think specifically lots of contemporary writing by male writers. That it's not that it's, you want to show how power works, right? But you can't begin that with a lie about the fact that power is not enjoyable. So that was sort of my sense that I would only be doing. That I wanted the book to have. To be totally, like in a way, when I think about the satires that are very successful, they're the ones like Wall Street, which is beloved by bankers, or you know, The Thing, which is totally legible as a sort of the thing that gets right the nature of the subject while also condemning it. So I wanted this book to be sort of readable by bodybuilders or by, you know, bros who want to go to the gym.
I think that's I think that's absolutely brilliant. I'm only pushing this line polemically to slightly annoy you and to rile you into making, which I think is a really important statement. This book makes, on the one hand, it's wonderfully enjoyable, right? We really want to read it. I read it on the beach in about, 2 hours, right? Couldn't put it down. And yet, on the other hand, it makes you feel uncomfortable. It makes you feel uncomfortable because not in its description of the visceral nature of, injecting your thighs with whatever it is, right? Through to this uncomfortable sense, exactly like The Wolf of Wall Street. Everybody loves The Wolf of Wall Street, and yet it's disgusting, right? It's this satire that celebrates and is complicit with, but as a result is authentic. And I think that's really interesting. I know we should move on a little bit, but can I read another passage? Stella, is that okay with you if we read a little bit of some of the enjoyable? Matthew, do you want to do it, or shall I've got the passage here.
Yeah, I don't actually have a copy of my own book, so you should do it.
Oh, okay. Well, just about this sort of enjoyable nature, the way in which although he's vile, he's sort of beyond good and evil. We actually want him to succeed. And here's a wonderful image of what transformation of the body does for his masculinity, and above all, the effect on others. I think that's interesting. So I'm reading from page 44. As his cycle progressed, Ned felt the benefits of his increasing strength flowing into the rest of his life. As long as he was hitting it hard in the gym, none of the things that had previously made him unhappy mattered. In fact, they didn't seem to be the case anymore. He now regarded his colleagues and clients with an amused, level, fond, sympathetic gaze. People who had known him for a long time gave him quizzical looks, surprised by his new energy and optimism. People who had seemed to disapprove of him, especially women, now looked at Ned as if they had noticed something new. He would see it happening. A flicker of confusion and a half smile would play across their faces, followed by a warm, attentive gaze. Right, it's interesting that masculinity isn't in himself, it's in the views of others. Anyway, let's carry on. One evening in late February, Ned was walking home from the gym when he heard a woman's voice say his name. Grace. Hello, Ned said, and leant in to kiss her on both cheeks. You're out late, said Grace. She nodded towards the huge gym bag slung over his shoulder. You look like a burglar. Ned laughed, casing a few joints. Have you been out? Ned, this is Federico. Sorry, I should have introduced you. Actually, you might have met before. Ned shook the man's hand, gripping firmly. He looked like one of Grace's graduate student friends, with a ratty ponytail and a receding hairline. And Ned sensed him shrink back when Ned said, with an enthusiasm that must have struck him as slightly deranged, How are you, Federico? I am well, Federico said, with what Ned took to be the studied, awkward dignity of a man meeting someone who has fucked his girlfriend more times than he has. What do you do? I'm working on neoliberalism and its effect on societal bonds, writing about my own country, Chile. Right, yes, Ned said. Now he remembered having met Federico. It was at the birthday party of another Grace's graduate friends, where Ned had got very drunk and ended up stuck in a corner with this bore who gave him a 10-minute lecture about his thesis topic. And Grace was dating him? The thought of it was hilarious. Ned looked at Grace. She looked tired, bundled into a shapeless black duffel coat that flattened her breasts into a single bulge and made her look short and blockish. And then he suggests they should meet up. And she says, okay, that would be great, she said. And it's really good to see you looking so fashionable. Ned laughed. He was wearing a plain maroon t-shirt and a grey hoodie that had both come from Primark, with some old jeans and trainers. Fashionable. He took it to be Grace's confused way of saying she found him attractive in a way that she didn't quite understand. Her gaze lingered smiling on his face for a second too long, and Federico looked annoyed. Ned put him out of his misery by telling them that he ought to get to bed. When Ned got home, he flicked through nude photos of Grace on his phone while idly stroking his cock until he fell asleep. It's the end of the quotation. But it's an image of this sort of enjoyable success, right, that he has through this sort of synthetic projection of himself, or this new Ned who comes out. I think perhaps we ought to come on to the second part of a discussion, if that's all right, Matthew. We can do that. But by way of a sort of segue, because I think Stella's going to be largely talking about film, we thought that we'd show you a clip that we hope will link the two bits of the presentation today. Right, so thank you for that. So there we had that a clip from Pumping Iron that Matthew earlier read us a quotation from in what I thought was a phenomenal Austrian accent, but it may lead Stella into what you have to say about styles of masculinity on film, and perhaps a slightly different way of thinking about how masculinity is perhaps not represented, but performed or experienced in the cinematic medium.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Tim. Obviously, I don't think there are any of my former students or out there, but anyone who's been taught by me will know that I write things down and then I abandon my script. That's most likely going to happen now. No, thanks for that wonderful reminder of Arnie. And as you know, really interesting to hear Matthew talk about AstroTurf and the kind of synthetically enhanced male body, because within film theory, quite often, literally, having just seen Arnold Schwarzenegger looking as extreme as he did in Pumping Iron 1, there's a kind of there's a sense in the writing about men in cinema, you know, from in the 80s and 90s especially, that form of masculinity, kind of the pumped up body, is a kind of extension of, in inverted commas, normal masculinity, as you know, a kind of idealized, not a distorted, or as Matthew read, vaguely obscene, but a kind of idealization of what men want to be, which seems absolutely extraordinary when you see how extreme it is. As Tim mentioned in his introduction, masculinity, unlike femininity, until relatively recently, has been defined as sort of hasn't been defined, but has been kind of understood as just sort of understood and in many ways taken for granted. Likewise, Hollywood, really, people talked about Hollywood as being kind of cinema, and the rest of it as being art cinema, Italian cinema, women's cinema, etc. Hollywood's always been defined slightly differently. And as the great Richard Dyer, one of the founding fathers of film studies, wrote, as a gay man talking about masculinity, he argued, for example, that masculinity is a bit like air, that you breathe it in all the time, but you aren't aware of it much. And I wanted to kind of unpick that, really, partly, and I'll explain briefly. I'm going to show you a little clip in a minute. But the book from which Tim quoted, Men's Cinema, is one of the books. I mean, I haven't written any books, it has to say, even any articles that haven't started from my interaction in the classroom. I think research is so, for most of us, is so intertwined with teaching in terms of developing thought. That's absolutely, you know, the most important forum for me. But Men's Cinema was a course that I taught for over many years, decades, sorry, I am very old, which came out of, firstly, wanted to give back something to a fantastic year that I taught when I was at Royal Holloway in the 1990s, that were amazing cinephiles, but nearly all men, right? And they'd come through me forcing them to watch melodramas and various other things. I thought, I know, in the third year, because they'd all stuck with me, I will give them a full 2 terms worth of what I term men's cinema of various different descriptions. And that led me to then try and articulate what I meant by men's cinema. But to go back to what Matthew was talking about, I'd like to play a short clip from the movie, from the documentary Pumping Iron 2, The Women. Pumping Iron was such a hit, that kind of started Arnold Schwarzenegger on his cinematic career. And then there was a fantastic documentary made a few years later called Pumping Iron 2, The Women, about the female bodybuilding scene. So I'd like to just play a clip from that without setting it up too much. So that was just one taster. I mean, I don't think you get no prizes for guessing who doesn't win. Bev Francis, the very muscular, the hyper-muscular Australian, comes last out of the finalists. They're down to 8, I think it is. So anyway, it's the world of bodybuilding is not ready for someone who challenges very conventional notions as defined, as outlined there by her big rival Rachel McLeish with all the hair, as being feminine. You know what it is to be feminine. You're meant to just look. You're still meant to look nice. And there's a fantastic scene earlier in the film where these judges male judges tie themselves in terrible knots about how to, what is the feminine bodybuilder. So back to what I'm talking about. So I thought that what comes out of that? What comes out of that clip is a sense that there's also a sense of what is normative femininity, and that one should be able to understand gender difference. And the most interesting critics to me have been people like Eve Sedgwick, like Judith Butler, like Jack Halberstam, who have basically argued that actually gender difference is not nearly as important and not as a concept as gender and sex fluidity. That one shouldn't attribute identity to biological difference, always in a way stemming from it, and that in itself is kind of problematic. Now, for example, in the 70s and 80s, there were a lot of theories that were based on binary oppositions. Ellen Sixou famously created a kind of understanding of the gender, of the difference between masculinity and femininity as based on binary. So male as active, female as passive. And one of the most important, film studies essay to date, Laura Mulvey's Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema from 1975, defined men as bearers of the look and women as defined by their to be looked atness. And what I wanted to do was to kind of challenge this and to see ways in which one could challenge this by actually saying one of the ways in which we're really narrowing down definitions is by not looking at how masculinity behaves on screen and how fluid that is. Now, I mentioned a bit of teaching, and one reason that I wanted to, one thing that started me on the journey of thinking about masculinity in film was a former female student of mine who became totally obsessed with Quentin Tarantino's film Reservoir Dogs, just totally. She went to see it 9 times in the first week. And Polly Rose is still a very sensible human being. And I was intrigued by this. So I went to see Reservoir Dogs at Leicester Square to be confronted by an audience of people who'd obviously seen it. This wasn't in its first week, was it second, third week, dressed as Reservoir Dogs, men and women. So they were dressed in their dark suits, sunglasses, which they took off when the film started. And it was really intriguing. I thought, what is happening with this? I'm going to play a clip from Reservoir Dogs towards the end. What it made me understand was something that actually film is so much more about emotional involvement, both in conscious and unconscious ways. So it's not just about representation. All that has been written about masculinity in cinema is so much about narrative and character. In fact, one thing that is so completely transformative for me is cinematic style. That actually there's a sense in which, if one thinks of masculinity as transcending representation and being more about style, actually one can develop a sort of theorization of masculinity that is, as I said earlier, much more fluid. Now this comes, I was bringing together, as I said, yes, very importantly, Tim is very kindly putting in the chat some of these names I'm kind of rattling through, but I can obviously kind of do that myself in a minute as well, but thanks ever so much, Tim. Jack Halberstam, for example, writing as Judith Halberstam, the trans critic who then became known as Jack, was critiquing Paul Smith's, not the fashion designer, but the cultural critic Paul Smith's, the cultural theorist Paul Smith's book, Boys, asking what is masculinity? And she continues, if masculinity is not the social and cultural and indeed political expression of maleness, then what is it? And for Halberstam, masculinity becomes legible as masculinity where and when it leaves the white male middle class body. So it does, she's arguing for almost the exact opposite of what most critics beforehand would have said masculinity was, which was the very embodiment of that thing that we didn't think about much because it had nothing to do to do with the other. And as Halberstam continues, female masculinity became the means by which a queer subject position that can successfully challenge hegemonic models of gender conformity can be explored. And for Halberstam and for others, the kind of definitional boundaries, if you like, between male and female are fluid and are elastic. I quoted Paul Smith. Actually, Paul Smith was on the cover of Paul Smith, the fashion designer, sorry, was on the cover of this week's Observer magazine, inside which there was a very short interview with the fashion designer Hussein Shalayan, who said, in response to one question, gender-free clothing is the future. And in a sense, I think there's quite a kind of temporal claim, I think, that we're making here. I think we have reached a very different understanding of gender, and alongside that, of how masculinity works. And that it is marked, I think, far more by, as I've said, its kind of fluidity, its ability to be cross-identified, so that me as a woman, I'm not necessarily confined to not being able to identify with male characters on screen. I mean, and so that actually masculinity on screen, one of its attractions, I think, is that it transcends conventionally understood categories and groups. So it's not that if you're not a white heterosexual male, you can't identify with Arnold Schwarzenegger or with Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible, but that actually what makes you be able to identify with him, with either those, with the Tom Cruise character, and I must admit to being a Mission Impossible fan, is that actually the style of film draws you into it. So in a sense, so it's not necessarily about what is going on the screen, but it's how that essence of the masculine, and I think this is very much rooted in what Jack Halberstam is identifying as female masculinity, in terms of how one can look at gender not as prescribed, if you like, and that as a cinematic spectator, you can, whatever end of the gender / sex spectrum you might put yourself, identify with the figures, exploits on the screen, and that what masculinity is about in cinema is about creating a very complex identity, which is about being energized, having a certain excitement, a certain camaraderie with the action on the screen, about making you feel in a very instinctive, emotive, physical, and even, as Tim was arguing earlier, visceral way, what is going on the screen. I want to now start to conclude by running, if I can share my screen, I'm going the second sequence of Reservoir Dogs. You're going to bear with me by looking at my screen, and I will find it. Okay, I wanted to, sorry, can you hear me? Yeah. I wanted to run to the end of the title sequence, but what I want to suggest with a film like For a Reason, which I'll explain in a minute. How does men's cinema work? I think if you think of what you've just seen in terms of Quentin Tarantino's the second sequence of Reservoir Dogs, that us as spectators are put in a kind of placed in quasi identification, not so much with the heroes and with the men that you see on the screen, but with the film's visual style, that how it conveys itself, how it represents masculinity is tied up with, I think, how it makes you want to be, for that moment only, the Reservoir Dogs. There's an excitement, there's a camaraderie, I think, generated by this kind of action sequence. And there are very specific, I think, ways in which Hollywood especially has used elements such as a group of men walking in slow motion, crane shots, the coordination of motion and music, motion and editing, as you get here, to make you feel wrongly, I think, that this is that kind of masculinity is kind of serenely confident in itself, but because you actually can feel all these elements, I feel that you're also, in a sense, being asked to unconsciously, perhaps indirectly, critique it. Masculinity goes far beyond representation in a sequence such as that, and goes to being a way of indirectly, unconsciously, as I've said, understanding and wanting to inhabit that kind of masculine body. So that's in a sense where I wanted to end, but why I wanted to play it to the end of to just after the title sequence was that I can't tell whether I'm on or not.
You are, Stella. Yeah, we can.
Okay, sorry, because there was something. I wanted to get it to play to the end of the title sequence, just to say that actually we've talked about irony, we've talked about satire. Lots of people don't see any kind of irony in Quentin Tarantino at all, but these idealized Reservoir Dogs are idealized and in control precisely until the end of the opening title sequence, when you see Tim Roth beginning to die. He spends the rest of the film dying. So, in fact, I think there is also a correlation, if you like, between the kind of stylistic excess of what is showing masculinity as being kind of performative and something fluid that we can all identify with, and the fact that it doesn't really believe in itself. And I thought that was a nice, when I read your novel, Matthew, I was thinking of characters such as the Tarantino characters who kind of mistakenly identify themselves as being in control in a kind of Lacanian sense. But Tarantino tells you that kind of 5 minutes in, they've completely lost control. And they are, by that, they are kind of fragmenting before our eyes. And I felt that was quite an interesting way of saying masculinity is far more complicated, in a sense, however attractive it is, to how we might have assumed it to be.
Matthew, do you want to respond to that, to Stella's comment there about sort of identification and power? Do you have anything to kind of come back with?
Yes, this question of the masculine image. Gosh. I think I mean, it's interesting having read that that bit earlier where Ned is sort of thinking about his experience through pumping iron, which is something that generations of bodybuilders have done, about this sense in which the kind of hypertrophied muscular masculinity of the weightlifting bodybuilding scene is premised on this idea of an image which you're sort of aspiring to and replaying in the hope of being admired by other bearers of that image. That was the thing that struck me in my excursions into the bodybuilding scene as a participant. This weird sense that it's like a kind of, it's like you go to a bodybuilding contest and it's like a kind of day-long aesthetics seminar where people are, where men are looking at other men's bodies and sort of thinking about the particular balance and proportion and shape of these muscle groups. And I think that that sense of the way that kind of shaping of what seems like a kind of supremely kind of masculine, muscular life is actually sort of weirdly aestheticized and kind of precious, is kind of interestingly related to aesthetics.
But also it raises, well, what you described raises a very interesting question, which is that, I mean, women's cinema, thinking back to second wave feminism and Laura Mulvey and things, was defined as cinema by and for women, right? And men's cinema, in a sense, I think, has been mistakenly understood as being cinema by and for men. You've described men looking at Arnie and thinking, how can I do that? How can I get to that point? Going to the competition and wanting to be those men. In a way, the scales fell from my eyes when I realised that actually, I don't think that's how films such as Mission Impossible, Die Hard, the kind of Thor movies are actually consumed. I think there's a much more diverse audience that enjoyed those films, and in a sense, suddenly realising that there are elements of styles that are common to all of these, that for the cinephiles among you will have thought, oh, they go back to films like, there are two formative texts, one being Sam Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch, another one being Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in the West, where things like slow motion, the use of certain stylistic tropes, actually was a way of expressing the fact that actually masculinity itself is quite fluid and quite diversely enjoyed as a spectacle. So I think the two worlds are perhaps quite different, even if they look quite similar. Thinking of the pumped up, Tom Cruise doesn't look like Arnie, but he doesn't look completely unlike Arnie. And thinking about someone like Chris Helmsford or whatever now.
Yes, I always enjoy that moment of disjunction in watching all sorts of TV and films where the male character who's playing a normal person going about an everyday life sort of takes their shirt off and reveals they have kind of 4% body fat and clearly is living the life of an athlete with a personal trainer and a dietitian who has no sugar in their diet and all this kind of stuff. And I think we're at an interesting moment where that is kind of, that sort of stopped being legible to a certain kind of viewer. That's just like, oh, well, of course, this guy who just works in an office takes his shirt off and he's unbelievably ripped. So that question of what the audience is for these images is a very interesting one. And of course, there's lots of senses in which there's a kind of damaging proliferation of the kind of massively ripped image, where you get the action figure of whichever superhero, and you can see how across decades it's now become like the action figure of a steroid user, whereas in 1970 it was just the action figure of a quite fit person.
Or even not fit. I mean, looking back, if you go back to a film such as Rear Window, to see James Stewart, who clearly had never, you know, sort of topless because of his, you know, when he's being kind of massaged at the beginning, having never been anywhere near a gym, and he was one of Hollywood's biggest stars. You know, I mean, the 1950s was the age of the chest, but it was not an overdeveloped, what wasn't an Arnie chest.
And no abs. If you look at Tarzan from the 50s, no abdominal muscles, right? No.
Absolutely.
Just sorry, I crashed out for a while, but I'm back. But think about the fluidity of masculinity and sort of linking perhaps what the two of you are talking about. I mean, the passage I read, you know, from Matthew's book was Ned's moment of triumph. But actually, the moment of triumph is the very last passage, the very last paragraph of the book, where he throws away his needles and his steroids. It's like he's experimented with one sort of masculinity with his pumped up body, but he's never been entirely serious about it, right? It's been an act. It's been a sort of sock puppet. And at the end of the novel, he realizes he can just put that away. There's another way of being a man that he can adopt. So, you know, I think, you know, perhaps giving a more sort of friendly reading of Matthew's book, if it is a morality tale, the morality is that masculinity need not be, you know, Arnie's pumped up muscles, but it would be something else. I don't know what you'd say to that, Matthew or Stella.
Well, yeah, I'm going to add to that, and then Matthew, sorry, we're all talking for you. But no, I really love I thought the endings are so hard. I thought the ending was fantastic. Sorry, this is a bit of a spoiler. Anyway, sorry, we're talking about the ending. But the idea that, to follow on from what Tim was saying, without being too kind of specific, the idea that it is a performative moment as well, you know, that it is something which you can be doing something else. Again, that is absolutely key, because it means that even though I could not possibly emulate Ned, you know, just I will not ever be him, I can imagine that I am. And for me, that's really key. And that's where the kind of men in their suits walking in, you know, slow motion with their shades, I can feel and I can feel that bodily response to it, which is why actually Arnie talking about the bodily response is really quite interesting. Even if I'm never going to be Harvey Keitel, like I'm never going to be Arnold Schwarzenegger. But I quite liked that idea that it was a performative moment and not just an all-defining one. And anything about Ned?
Thank you. I like that reading. Yeah. I guess one thing I wanted to do in the book was to make clear that the stakes were quite low all along, and that there's something that actually the kind of triumph that Ned finds through this accelerated sense of how he can intervene in his own life is actually a fairly small one, which shifts his kind of class position in an extremely modest way, where he's able to accrue a small amount of capital, you know, in yeah. Exactly. He's sort of by the end of 1 year, having sort of been doing all right for himself, he's then got a small lump sum which can just give him a kickstart to go and try something else. Having felt rather kind of defeatist before that.
Stella, if you're okay with this, Matthew, I think this is a perfect point to move on, because we've got to the end, as it were, of the novel, and what happens there is his world opens out, right? The next novel happens a few years later, and if the first novel is about possibilities expanding, here the possibilities are much bigger. He arrives in Berlin with his sort of girlfriend Alice, though they're not really girlfriends, and the second novel, she plays a much bigger part. It's more of a sort of two protagonists. And this is where we get to Viral, right? He's moving on to bigger things in foreign territories, right, where the possibilities of new forms of being that he can inhabit are all that much, or that there are all that many more of them. And perhaps, Matthew, we could sort of bring today's session to an end Well, unless there are questions from those of you who are out there in the digital darkness who want to come into light and answer, but maybe we'll do this after a little brief discussion of the new novel and perhaps a reading from that novel to give us a sense of what it's about. So, Matthew, can you set us the scene of Viral a few years later in Berlin, and maybe read us a little bit, and then we'll sort of come to the end of our evening, perhaps maybe taking a few questions if there are we need to address, but you know, let's move on to that bit.
Yeah, I will. Thank you. Yes. So Viral, here we are. Viral came out about a month ago, and it picks up. AstroTurf is set in 2015, and Viral. No, sorry, AstroTurf is set in 2012, and Viral is set in 2015, 3 years later. So it picks up Ned and also Alice, who they've been boyfriend and girlfriend in AstroTurf, but 3 years later they've reconvened in Berlin, and they've had this idea of starting a kind of social media marketing agency, which is sort of drawing on Ned's expertise from the first book. The bit I want to read is from a staff meeting they have. It almost seems a bit nostalgic now, but it's a staff meeting where they're all actually in the same room and sort of talking to each other rather than on a Zoom meeting. But this is from the old world of staff meetings. So at this point, they've been running this social media marketing company, and Ned is thinking about how they might diversify. So this section is a brainstorming session told from Ned's point of view. So we're saying that the future is in platforms, right? The future is in Uberizing more and more goods and services, taking away all the overheads and all the restrictions around connecting providers to consumers. What we need to do then is to work out what to Uberize next. Ned was in his groove, striding up and down by the windows at the side of the meeting room. The brainstorming session seemed to be going well. Everyone seemed engaged. Daniel was nodding profoundly, and Folashada had a quizzical look on her face. Ned dragged the whiteboard out from the corner, wiped it down, and said, "Can we think about that for the next few minutes?" Ned played the part of a startup guru with an irony that was perhaps lost on some of his colleagues. After all, what was the difference between his manner in these meetings, his mastery of specialized jargon, his sense of purpose, his conviction about the direction the future was going in, and every other guys who came to Berlin with an idea for a startup? If anything, he was better at it than the ridiculous people he had met at that seed funding fair last year, before Alice had come on board. Most of them only had one idea, if that, whereas he had ideas to spare. They just seemed to come to him, as if he could gather them out of the air. So, in everything we've been doing, we've been talking about emotion, right? About the way that it's emotional reactions and not really rational thinking that power people's choices. What we need to do is to harness that discussion and to think about the products, the encounters, the kinds of connection between people that produce an emotional reaction. And then we can ruthlessly exploit them for our own profit, right? Everyone except Alice laughed, and Alice smiled indulgently. So where do we start with this? Silence. "Daniel," Ned said. "Good morning." "Good morning." "Tell me, talk me through the emotional reactions you've experienced so far today, everything leading up to your arriving at the office." Daniel laughed nervously. "Let me see," he said. "I felt happy when Jana texted me when I was waking up. She is in Leipzig at a social enterprise conference, so we haven't seen each other this week." "Okay," Ned said, "tell me more." "And then I guess I was feeling rather sexy when we were IMing while we were still in bed. Is that an emotion?" "Now we're talking," Ned said, and wrote SEX in large letters in one corner of the whiteboard. "But let's come back to that in the future if we need to. I'm pretty sure that dating sites and pornography and all that sort of thing are too crowded as markets for us to do anything with. Let's leave that there. Any other emotional reactions you want to tell us about? Did anything make you feel angry, frustrated, guilty today?" "I can't think of anything. It has not been a very emotional morning." "Okay, anyone else?" I felt guilty this morning, said Richard. Twice, actually. First, when I realised I'd forgotten my sister's birthday yesterday, and then when I passed a homeless guy at my U-Bahn station. Now that's interesting, Ned said. Did you give him any money? No. But did you think about it? I did think about it, yeah. It's so freezing at the moment and everything. But then I thought, I'm not all that rich right now. I'm not earning much. I can't give money to everyone. And anyway, what do I really know about this guy? You know, what's he going to do with the money if I give him a few euros? Ned wrote homelessness on the whiteboard, took a sip of water and said, can we do anything with that? You could make an app that was like a mapping app that showed where the highest concentration of homeless people were at any moment, said another of the interns. Ned frowned. What would that achieve? I don't know, it just came to me. I guess it would help people who wanted to donate money go to the right part of town to do it. Yeah, I don't think that really works. Let's park that for now, Ned said. Anyway, how would you track the concentration, said Tristan, laughing. Would we tag the homeless with GPS devices? There were a few laughs around the group, and the intern looked embarrassed. Ned said, I don't hear any bright ideas from you, Tristan, so keep it to yourself, yeah? Maybe if there was an app where we could provide more information, Folashada said, so that people could make better informed decisions about whether to donate money or not. Now that's interesting, Ned said. How would that go? Alice spoke for the first time. You could model it on a crowdfunding app. Each homeless person has their own profile, and users can find out more about them and their stories and see who else has given them money. I like it, Ned said, pacing briefly in front of the whiteboard before writing Uberize the homeless? ? On there and turning back towards the team. What sort of information would have made you more likely to give him money today? He asked Richard. Like if you knew that it wouldn't just go on crack or whatever? I see what you mean, but I think we want a stronger storytelling element than that. There needs to be a narrative to make people give their money, a backstory and some attainable target. Ned was looking at Alice and she responded, so we make sure each profile has the story of how they ended up on the streets. We make it relatable. Yeah, Ned said, but it also needs a forward-looking element. We don't just want how they ended up on the streets, we want how they're going to get out of it, how each donation is going to help them out of their situation. The point of the app should be to help them get training or qualifications so that they're asking for something specific that will help them turn their lives around. Like a GoFundMe for the homeless, said Alice. Exactly, said Ned. Click here to give brave Joachim 10 euros towards his goal of raising whatever amount of tuition fees to become an electrician. That sort of thing. And how do we make money? I guess we just take an administration fee from each donation. We run it like a charity. We can make money, but we can also do something genuinely good, and we raise the profile of the Thing Factory in the meantime for our profit-making ventures. I like it, said Alice. Let's Uberize the homeless. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Matthew. Listen, we're going to bring things to a close now, but do go out and buy Viral. There's a link in the chat. It's a fantastic novel that expands immensely into the Uberization of everything, the commodification and marketization of homelessness and sex and love and loyalty and so on. And it's a hugely enjoyable read. So it just reminds me to thank everybody involved. Thank you, Stella, for your insights. It really amplified our discussion. Thank you, Matthew, for sharing your books with us. Thank you, Natasha, for organizing this week and helping us shape our ideas here. Thank you, Jess and Georgina, who've provided the technical stuff. And most of all, thank you, everybody who's been there online. And we do hope that you'll come along to the rest of this week and indeed the week's events and indeed those of the Inspiring Mind season as a whole. So thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful evening.